Snow drifted softly through the London streets, transforming the December evening into something almost magical. The gas lamps strung along the buildings cast warm pools of gold and amber across the cobblestones where last-minute shoppers hurried past, their arms full of parcels and their faces bright with anticipation. Lord Henry Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe, stood alone beneath a flickering gas lamp near the square, watching the world celebrate around him. At 41, he was one of the most powerful men in England, a man whose name appeared regularly in Parliament records and whose opinions influenced the empire itself. He wore an expensive charcoal greatcoat that fit him perfectly, tailored gloves on his hands, his dark hair styled in a way that suggested both nobility and careful attention to detail. He had everything most men dreamed of: a grand townhouse with marble floors overlooking Hyde Park, a carriage with the Ashcombe crest that turned heads on every street, estates across 3 counties, investments that would keep generations comfortable, success beyond measure. And yet, as Christmas Eve drew near, Lord Henry found himself standing alone on the street corner, watching families hurry toward warm homes while he had nowhere to go and no one waiting for him. Hey, quick question, how are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. I'm working toward 1,000 subscribers, and if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for Duke's Royal Library, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Alright, thank you. Now, let's get back to the story. His parents had passed away years ago within months of each other, leaving him an only heir with no immediate family to call his own. His wife had left him 5 years earlier, tired of coming second to his duties, tired of the long hours in Parliament and missed dinners, and the way he reviewed estate documents even in their private chambers. She'd remarried last year to a country vicar, someone who would be home for tea every afternoon, someone who would remember her birthday. And Henry had seen the wedding announcement in the Times and felt nothing, just a hollow emptiness where emotion should have been. He certainly had colleagues, lords who respected his political acumen, businessmen who sought his counsel, peers who valued his vote in the House. But friends, real friends who called just to see how he was doing, who remembered the man beneath the title, who invited him to their homes not for political favor but simply for companionship, those had fallen away over the years. Casualties of his single-minded focus on legacy, duty, and the preservation of the Ashcombe name. His staff respected him. His tenants honored him. Society deferred to him, but no one loved him. So here he was on Christmas Eve, standing on a street corner, because going back to his empty townhouse felt unbearable. The servants would be preparing for their own modest celebrations in the servants' hall. The grand rooms upstairs would echo with silence. The dining table that could seat 20 would have a single place setting, if any at all. He told himself he was simply taking the air after leaving his club, but the truth was he had nowhere else to be. The gifts he'd ordered for his household staff had been handled by his butler, wrapped and distributed without his involvement. The obligatory charitable donations had been sent to the usual organizations. His social obligations had been fulfilled, and now there was nothing. No one. Just the cold and the snow and the distant sound of church bells ringing for Christmas Eve service. Henry watched a family pass by. A father in a modest coat holding his wife's arm, 2 children bundled against the cold, all of them laughing about something, their breath forming little clouds in the winter air. The mother reached down to adjust her daughter's bonnet, her touch so tender, so natural. The father swung his son up onto his shoulders, and the boy's delighted squeal cut through the evening. Something twisted painfully in Henry's chest. This was his life now. Success without substance, achievement without affection, a title that commanded respect but inspired no love. He had built an empire of influence and property, but he would die alone in it, unmourned, except by those paid to mourn. The Ashcombe legacy would continue through distant cousins. His name would be remembered in history books, but Lord Henry Ashcombe, the man, would disappear as if he'd never existed at all. He pulled his greatcoat tighter against the cold, preparing to return to his carriage, to go back to that silent townhouse, and perhaps lose himself in brandy and correspondence. At least work never judged him. At least duty never left him. But as he turned to leave, a small voice stopped him cold. "Sir, why are you standing all alone on Christmas?" Henry looked down to find a little girl standing directly in front of him, her face tilted upward with the kind of fearless curiosity only children possess. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with brown curls escaping from beneath a knitted bonnet that had seen better days. She wore a grey coat that was too thin for the weather, patched at the elbows, and in her small arms she clutched a worn teddy bear with one eye missing and stuffing poking through a seam. "Hello," Henry said, his voice rusty from disuse. He glanced around instinctively, searching for a parent or guardian. "Where is your family, child?" "Right there," she said, pointing a mittened hand toward a woman loading parcels into a small hand cart about 30 feet away. "That's my mama. I'm Eliza. What's your name?" "Lord Henry Ashcombe," he replied automatically, then immediately felt foolish. What child needed to know his full title? But Eliza's eyes widened with delight rather than intimidation. "That's a very fancy name. Are you a prince?" "Not quite. A duke." "What's a duke?" Henry found himself smiling despite everything. "Someone who has many responsibilities and apparently no one to share Christmas with." Eliza's expression transformed instantly from curiosity to concern, her small face crumpling with genuine distress. "You don't have anyone? Not even for Christmas?" "Not really, no." "But that's terrible." She stepped closer, her free hand reaching out to grasp his gloved fingers with surprising strength. "Mama says nobody should be alone on Christmas. She says Christmas is about family and love and being together. Don't you have a family?" The directness of the question struck Henry like a physical blow. Children had no artifice, no social grace to cushion hard truths. "I had one once," he said quietly. "But not anymore." Eliza squeezed his hand tighter. "Then you should come have party at my place. We're having turkey and pudding, and Mama made biscuits. You can come with us. You shouldn't be all alone." Before Henry could formulate a response, the woman Eliza had pointed to earlier appeared, slightly breathless, her face flushed with cold and worry. "Eliza Margaret Mayfield, I told you to stay by the cart." She turned to Henry, and recognition flashed across her features, followed immediately by fear. She dropped into a curtsy so deep, it was nearly a collapse. "Your Grace, I am so terribly sorry. Please forgive my daughter's presumption." "There's nothing to forgive," Henry said gently. She was merely being kind, but he could see the terror in the woman's eyes. She knew who he was. Everyone in London knew the Duke of Ashcombe, and here was her child, touching him, speaking to him as if he were just another person on the street. "Come along, Eliza," the woman said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We mustn't trouble His Grace any further." "But Mama, he's all alone on Christmas. We have to invite him home." "You said nobody should be alone." The woman's face went pale. "Eliza, His Grace has his own plans." "Important people don't. She invited me to dinner," Henry said quietly, "and I find myself without other obligations this evening." Margaret Mayfield stared at him as if he'd suddenly sprouted a second head. "Your Grace, surely you cannot be serious. Our home is not. We are not." She trailed off, clearly unable to articulate the impossibility of what was happening. Henry understood perfectly. A duke did not visit working-class homes. A man of his station did not accept invitations from strangers in the street. The social order was absolute, and what Eliza was proposing violated every unspoken rule that governed Victorian society. If anyone saw him entering their building, Margaret's reputation would be destroyed. She would be accused of social climbing, of using her child to entrap a wealthy man. She could lose her position, her housing, everything. And yet, as he looked at this woman with her worn coat and tired eyes, holding her daughter's hand with such fierce protectiveness, he saw something he recognized. She was alone too, in her own way, a widow perhaps, or abandoned, raising a child with no husband, working whatever jobs she could find, trying to maintain dignity in a world that showed no mercy to women in her position. "Mrs. Mayfield," he said formally, using the courtesy title, even though he had no idea if she was truly married. "I understand your hesitation, but I assure you, my presence in your home will be discreet. No one need know. And in exchange for your daughter's kindness, I would be honored to share your Christmas dinner." "Your Grace, I cannot possibly." "Please, Mama," Eliza interrupted, her voice small and pleading. "He has nobody. We have to help." Margaret looked down at her daughter, then back at Henry. He saw the war playing out across her face, fear of social ruin battling against the very values she'd clearly taught her child. The desire to protect Eliza from the harsh realities of class divisions fighting against the simple human impulse to help someone in need. Finally, she took a shaky breath. "Our home is very modest, Your Grace. Nothing like what you're accustomed to. We have only simple food, and no servants to wait upon you properly." "That sounds perfect," Henry said, and meant it. And you must leave by a reasonable hour. If the neighbors see, I understand completely. Margaret nodded slowly, still looking as if she might faint from the sheer impossibility of what she was agreeing to. Very well then. Eliza, give His Grace your bear to carry. We need you to help with the parcels. And so it was that Lord Henry Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe, found himself walking through the working-class streets of London on Christmas Eve, carrying a one-eyed teddy bear while a 4-year-old girl chatted beside him about everything and nothing, and her terrified mother pushed a cart full of groceries ahead of them, glancing back every few steps as if expecting him to vanish like a fever dream. The building was exactly what Henry had expected. Old brick, worn steps, paint peeling near the doorframe. They climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs, Eliza bouncing ahead with boundless energy, while Margaret struggled with the cart, and Henry found himself automatically reaching to help, earning a shocked look from her that suggested dukes didn't carry groceries. The apartment itself was tiny. The entire space would have fit inside Henry's library with room to spare. But the moment he stepped through the door, he felt something he hadn't experienced in his own home in years. Warmth. Not just from the small coal fire burning in the grate, but something intangible, something that had nothing to do with temperature. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, barely 4 feet tall, decorated with paper chains and dried orange slices and ornaments that were clearly handmade. Mismatched furniture sat around the room, each piece obviously second-hand, but polished with care. Drawings covered one wall, childish crayon sketches of flowers and houses and stick-figure families. Books were stacked on every available surface, their spines cracked from repeated reading. It was nothing like Henry's townhouse with its Persian rugs and crystal chandeliers and furniture that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. And it was infinitely more beautiful. "Mother, we're home," Margaret called toward what Henry assumed was the kitchen. "And we've brought a guest." An older woman emerged, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She had grey hair pulled back severely, and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she missed very little. When she saw Henry, those eyes went wide, and she performed a curtsy that was far more practiced than her daughters had been. Clearly, she'd been in service at some point in her life. "Mother, this is Lord Henry Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe," Margaret said, her voice still holding that edge of disbelief. "Eliza invited him for Christmas dinner." "Did she now?" Mrs. Rose Mayfield said, her tone unreadable. She studied Henry with an intensity that made him feel as if he were being evaluated for purchase. "Your Grace, I hope you'll forgive my granddaughter's boldness. The child doesn't understand boundaries." "On the contrary, Mrs. Mayfield," Henry said, "your granddaughter possesses a kindness that many in my social sphere have long since abandoned. I'm grateful for her invitation." Rose's eyes narrowed slightly, and Henry got the distinct impression she was trying to determine if he was mocking them. After a long moment, she nodded. "Well then, welcome to our home, Your Grace. Dinner will be ready shortly. Margaret, help me in the kitchen. Eliza, entertain our guest." As the 2 women disappeared, leaving him alone with Eliza, Henry found himself uncertain for the first time in years. In Parliament, he commanded respect. In business dealings, he held all the power. But here, in this tiny apartment that smelled of roasting meat and coal smoke, he was completely out of his element. Eliza solved his dilemma by grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the Christmas tree. "Look, I made this star with Grandmama, and this angel is from when Mama was little. And this one Papa made before he went to heaven." Henry knelt beside her, examining each ornament as if it were made of precious gems, listening to the story behind every paper chain and dried fruit. And as he did, something inside his chest began to thaw, like ice that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Dinner was served at a small table that barely accommodated 4 people. The turkey was slightly dry but seasoned with herbs Henry couldn't name. The potatoes were simple but rich with butter. The vegetables had clearly been stretched to feed an extra mouth, and Henry felt a pang of guilt, knowing his unexpected presence meant less food for this family. But as they ate, as Eliza chattered about her day and Margaret reminded her to use proper manners, and Rose poured gravy with the practiced ease of someone who'd cooked 1,000 meals, Henry felt something he couldn't quite name. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. A sense of being part of something rather than separate from everything. "So, Your Grace," Rose said, her tone conversational but her eyes still sharp. "What brings a duke to our humble table? And please don't tell me it's just my granddaughter's charm." "Mother," Margaret hissed. "It's a fair question," Rose continued, unperturbed. A man in your position doesn't accept random invitations from street urchins unless there's a reason. So, what is it? Curiosity? Charity? Some kind of social experiment? Henry set down his fork carefully. He could lie, offer some pleasant platitude about the Christmas spirit. But something about Rose's directness demanded honesty. I was alone, he said simply. Completely alone. And your granddaughter noticed. She offered me something I haven't had in years. And what's that? Someone who cared that I existed. The table fell silent. Even Eliza stopped talking, looking between the adults with confused eyes. Rose studied him for a long moment. You're telling me that a duke, with all your power and money and influence, has nobody? I have colleagues, business associates, political allies, people who want something from me or fear disappointing me. Henry met her gaze steadily. But friends? Family? People who would notice if I disappeared tomorrow? No, Mrs. Mayfield. I have none of those. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard, Rose said bluntly. And I've heard some sad things in my time. Mother, please, Margaret whispered, clearly mortified. But Rose wasn't finished. Your Grace, I may be just a working woman, but I know loneliness when I see it. You've got that look about you, like a man who's forgotten what it feels like to be loved, or maybe you never knew in the first place. The words hit Henry like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, but found he couldn't, because she was right. Absolutely, devastatingly right. I built a legacy, he said finally, his voice rough. I preserved the Ashcombe name. I fulfilled every duty my title demanded, but somewhere along the way, I forgot to build a life. Rose nodded, satisfied. Well, you're here now. And in this house, duke or not, you're just Henry. We don't have room for titles at our table. Here, you eat what we eat, you laugh when something's funny, and you pass the potatoes when they're asked for. Understood? Understood, Henry said, and felt something inside him crack open completely. I need to pause here for just a moment. If you're still watching, if this story is touching something deep inside you, I have to be honest with you. Creating stories like this, stories that matter, stories that remind us what it means to be human, it takes time, it takes heart, and it takes support from people like you. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, not for vanity, but because it means these stories reach more people who need them. People sitting alone right now, feeling exactly like the Duke, people who've forgotten what connection feels like. If you haven't subscribed yet, please, I'm asking you to do it now. Hit that subscribe button for Duke's Royal Library. Smash the like button. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, or which moment has hit you the hardest so far. It genuinely helps more than you know. Every subscription tells me to keep creating these stories. Every comment reminds me why this matters. Thank you. Now let's get back to Henry's story. After dinner, they moved to the small sitting room. Rose settled into her chair with some mending, her practiced hands working needle and thread while Margaret cleared the table. Eliza, full of food and excitement, grabbed Henry's hand and pulled him toward a small shelf packed with books. "Will you read me a story?" she asked, her eyes wide and hopeful. Henry glanced at Margaret, who looked torn between allowing it and maintaining some semblance of proper distance. "If His Grace is tired, I would be delighted," Henry said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Eliza selected a worn copy of a fairy tale collection and climbed onto the threadbare sofa, patting the space beside her expectantly. Henry sat, acutely aware of how strange this must look, a duke in his expensive clothes, sitting on furniture that had been patched multiple times, about to read bedtime stories to a working-class child. He opened the book and began to read. Eliza listened with rapt attention, occasionally interrupting to ask questions or point at the illustrations. Her enthusiasm was infectious, her wonder genuine. When had Henry last felt wonder? When had he last looked at anything with pure, uncomplicated joy? By the second story, Eliza had gradually shifted closer, her small body pressing against his side. By the third, her head was resting on his arm, her eyelids growing heavy. Henry kept reading, his voice softening as sleep claimed her. The teddy bear was tucked under her chin, one small hand clutching the fabric of his coat sleeve. He sat very still, afraid to move and disturb her. The warmth of her small body against his side felt alien and precious at once. When was the last time someone had trusted him enough to fall asleep beside him? When was the last time anyone had sought his presence for comfort rather than advantage? Margaret appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a cloth. She stopped when she saw them, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry, Your Grace." "Eliza, wake up. Please don't," Henry said quietly. "Let her sleep." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She crossed the room and carefully lifted her daughter, cradling her against her shoulder. Eliza stirred but didn't wake, making small, contented sounds as her mother carried her toward what must be a bedroom. Henry stood, suddenly uncertain. The evening was drawing to a close. He should leave, return to his townhouse, pretend this strange interlude had never happened. But he didn't want to. Rose was watching him with those sharp eyes. "You look like a man who's just realized something important." "I am," Henry admitted. "I've spent years convinced that duty and legacy were enough, that emotional attachments were weaknesses that would distract from what truly mattered." He looked at the doorway where Margaret had disappeared. "But watching your granddaughter trust me enough to fall asleep beside me, experiencing the warmth of your home, the honesty of your conversation, I realize I've been wrong about everything." "So what are you going to do about it?" Rose asked bluntly. "I don't know," Henry said. "But I know I can't go back to the life I had before tonight. I can't pretend this didn't happen." It was late when Henry finally stepped through the doors of his townhouse. The butler, who had waited up despite the hour, looked startled by his master's appearance. Henry's coat was rumpled, his hair slightly disheveled from where Eliza had touched it with her sticky fingers. He probably smelled of coal smoke and simple cooking. "Your Grace," we were becoming concerned. "Shall I prepare a late supper?" "No, thank you, Winters. That will be all." Henry climbed the grand staircase to his private chambers, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The house was exactly as he'd left it, perfectly appointed, immaculately maintained, utterly lifeless. He stood in his bedroom, looking at the enormous four-poster bed that had been in his family for generations. Tonight, it looked absurdly large. An ocean of expensive fabric and carved wood designed for one person who would sleep alone. He thought of Eliza's tiny apartment, where 3 people lived in a space smaller than his dressing room, where mismatched furniture and handmade decorations created more warmth than all his Persian rugs and crystal chandeliers combined. Moving to his study, Henry poured himself a brandy and sat in the leather chair where he'd spent countless hours reviewing documents, making business decisions, planning political strategies. This room had been his refuge, his kingdom. From here, he'd built an empire of influence and wealth. And for what? He looked around at the mahogany desk, the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the oil paintings of stern ancestors judging him from their gilded frames. All of it suddenly felt like a mausoleum, a beautiful, expensive tomb where he'd buried himself alive while calling it duty. Henry thought about tomorrow, about the day after, about the years stretching ahead. He could return to his carefully ordered life, treat tonight as an aberration. In time, the memory would fade. Eliza would forget him. Margaret would tell the story of the Duke who came to dinner as an unbelievable tale. Or he could choose differently. He set down his brandy untouched and moved to his writing desk. Pulling out a sheet of heavy stationery embossed with the Ashcombe crest, he began to write. Not business correspondence, not political maneuvering, but a simple letter to Margaret Mayfield, thanking her for her hospitality and asking permission to call again. As he sealed the envelope, Henry felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Terrifying, exhilarating hope that perhaps it wasn't too late to build something real. The scandal, when it came, was inevitable. Henry began visiting the Mayfield apartment regularly, always discreet, always careful, but in a city like London, secrets never lasted long. Within weeks, whispers circulated through society. The Duke of Ashcombe was keeping company with working-class women. He'd been seen in their neighborhood. Some said it was charity. Others suggested something more sordid. Henry ignored them all. He hired Margaret as the manager of one of his smaller properties, paying her a proper wage that allowed them to move to a better apartment in a respectable neighborhood. He funded Eliza's education at an excellent school, enduring the raised eyebrows when he attended her school performances. He spent Christmas with them, and Easter, and countless ordinary Sundays, when there was no excuse, except that he wanted to be there. The Tun was scandalized. Fellow lords questioned his judgment. His business associates worried about his mental state. Some suggested he was being manipulated, deceived by clever working-class women seeking to elevate their station. Henry didn't care, because for the first time in his adult life, he was happy. not the grim satisfaction of a successful negotiation or the cold pride of a political victory, but genuine, warm, complicated happiness that came from being part of something larger than himself. Margaret remained cautious for months, maintaining proper distance, always calling him Your Grace, despite his repeated requests that she use his name. She understood the impossibility of their situation better than he did. She'd lived her entire life within the rigid boundaries of class, knew what happened to women who overstepped. But slowly, gradually, she began to trust that his interest was genuine, that he wasn't simply amusing himself with novelty that would fade, that he truly valued her company, her honesty, her strength. 2 years after that first Christmas, on a quiet evening in her sitting room while Eliza did homework at the table, Henry proposed. Not with grand gestures or elaborate planning, but simply, honestly, with his heart completely exposed. Margaret stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Your Grace, you cannot possibly. Henry, he corrected gently. Please, Margaret, just Henry. Henry, then, you cannot marry me. Society would never accept it. Your peers would ostracize you. Think of your position, your legacy. I've spent my entire life thinking of those things, Henry interrupted. And they brought me nothing but loneliness. You, Eliza, Rose, you've given me everything that matters. If society cannot accept that, then perhaps society is wrong. But I'm not asking you to elevate yourself to my station, Henry said. I'm asking if I can belong to yours. 5 years later, on a snowy Christmas Eve, the Ashcombe townhouse was unrecognizable from the silent mausoleum it had once been. Children's laughter echoed through halls that had known only quiet footsteps. The formal dining room had been transformed, its long table now set for 20 rather than 1. Henry stood at the entrance, watching guests arrive. Not lords and ladies, though some of those had reconciled themselves to his choice. Not business associates seeking favor, but families, working-class families with children and elderly relatives. People who'd been alone, who'd been lonely, who'd been overlooked. Every Christmas, Henry had begun a new tradition. He would walk the streets, as he had that first night, looking for others who stood apart, who watched the celebrations from the margins, and he would invite them home. Not everyone accepted. Some were too proud, others too suspicious, but enough did that his home had become known in certain circles as a place where the forgotten were remembered, where the lonely found family, if only for an evening. Margaret moved through the crowd with practiced ease, no longer the nervous working-class woman afraid of overstepping. She was the Duchess of Ashcombe now, a title she wore with grace and quiet dignity. Some still whispered about the scandal of their marriage, but most had moved on to newer gossip. And those who mattered, those whose opinions Henry valued, had come to respect her deeply. Eliza, now 9 years old, and already showing signs of the remarkable woman she would become, was organizing the children into some complicated game that involved much shrieking and running. She caught Henry's eye and waved, grinning, and he waved back, his chest tight with love. Rose sat in a place of honor near the fire, holding court with several elderly guests, dispensing wisdom and sharp observations with equal measure. She'd moved into the townhouse 2 years ago when her health had begun failing, and had proceeded to terrify and charm the staff in equal measure. Quite a change from that first Christmas, isn't it? Margaret said softly, appearing at Henry's side and slipping her hand into his. Yes, Henry agreed, though I'm not sure I fully appreciated the magnitude of that change at the time. Do you ever regret it? The scandal, the whispers, the peers who still won't acknowledge me properly. Henry turned to face her fully, cupping her face in his hands. I regret only that it took me 41 years to understand what truly matters. I regret the decades I wasted pursuing things that meant nothing. I regret that my parents never knew this happiness. He kissed her forehead gently. But I have never, not for one moment, regretted choosing you, choosing this, choosing love over legacy. You still have your legacy, Margaret pointed out. You're still the Duke. You still serve in Parliament, manage the estates. But now I have a reason for all of it, Henry interrupted. Before, it was duty, obligation. Now it's building something that matters, something I can share with you and Eliza. Legacy isn't about name or title. It's about the lives we touch, the love we create. As if summoned by his words, Eliza appeared, tugging on his coat. Papa, Grandmama Rose says it's time to find this year's lonely person. Can I come with you? Henry looked at Margaret, who nodded. Just the square and back, she said, and stay close to your father. They bundled up against the cold, Henry and Eliza walking hand in hand through the snowy streets, just as they had that first Christmas 5 years ago. Except now, Eliza was the one leading, the one looking for lonely faces in the crowd. "There," she said, pointing. "That lady on the bench. She looks sad." Henry followed her gaze and saw an elderly woman sitting alone, her coat threadbare, her face etched with sorrow. He remembered how he'd felt that first Christmas, the hollow emptiness, the certainty that no one cared. "Shall we invite her home?" he asked Eliza. "Yes," she said firmly. "Nobody should be alone on Christmas. You taught me that." They approached together, father and daughter, the Duke and the little girl who'd saved him. And as Eliza smiled at the elderly woman and asked why she was sitting all alone, Henry felt the circle complete. He'd been rescued once by the simple kindness of a child who refused to let someone suffer alone. And now he spent his life passing that gift forward, one lonely soul at a time. The Ashcombe legacy would be remembered not for political achievements or business success, but for this: a home that welcomed the forgotten, a family built not on blood or class, but on love, a tradition that said no one, regardless of station or circumstance, should face Christmas alone. Every year, as snow fell on London and gas lamps glowed against the dark, Henry would remember the man he'd been, the Duke who had everything and nothing, the Lord who commanded respect but inspired no love. And he would thank God and fate and whatever forces had guided a 4-year-old girl to notice him that night, to see past his title and expensive clothes to the lonely man beneath. Because Eliza Mayfield hadn't just invited him to dinner that Christmas Eve, she'd invited him back to life. Thank you so much for staying with Henry's story until the very end. If this touched your heart, if it reminded you that it's never too late to choose love over loneliness, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Duke's Royal Library for more stories that matter. Hit that like button, and in the comments, tell me, have you ever been the lonely person or the one who reached out? Your stories matter too. Until next time, remember that the greatest legacy we can leave is the love we give and the lonely souls we refuse to overlook. God bless and Merry Christmas. Thank you.